Welcome everyone to Monday Match Analysis Classics. I'm Gill. Today's episode is an analysis of the 2013 French Open semifinal between Rafael Nadal and Novak Djokovic, and I'm joined by Hall of Fame tennis writer and author Steve Flink. By now, you know him very well, always insightful. But before we get into this match and before we get into our conversation, I do want to go over some Rafael tactics, some Nadal-Djokovic tactics, because I have covered at length, whether it be after the 2019 Australian Open final or in my Monday Match Analysis Classics episode of the 2012 Australian Open final between Djokovic and Nadal. I have covered at length how Djokovic is able to rush Nadal on his forehand side. His backhand is so good, his cross-court backhand is so good that he's often able to take so much time away and hit the ball on the rise and handle Nadal's heavy topspin forehand in a way that enables Djokovic to coax short balls out of Nadal by attacking the Rafa forehand. And after he does that, he can change direction down the line with his backhand, or he can run around the backhand and open the court with the inside-out forehand or the inside-in forehand. That is a pattern that's very problematic for Nadal on faster courts. It all changes on clay courts because, to my eyes, Djokovic is no longer able to rush Nadal on the forehand side on a clay court because instead of the ball skidding through the court, the clay court grabs the ball. It slows down the ball. And it buys Nadal the requisite time on the forehand side where he is no longer in a position where maybe he has to abbreviate his swing, or he doesn't get his feet in position, or the ball's coming so hard that he's not comfortable changing direction. That all changes. So just to give you an idea of what I'm seeing. So here's a deep backhand by Djokovic to Nadal forehand, and he gets another. Djokovic steps in, takes the ball on the rise, cranks this backhand cross court again to the Nadal forehand. And this is the situation where I think Nadal is very, very comfortable simply changing direction down the line, using his big, heavy forehand and doing damage to Novak Djokovic on a clay court. And that's a clean winner down the line. It's a lot harder for Nadal to change that pattern and go down the line when he's playing in Australia at the Australian Open or in England at Wimbledon. But in the French, I no longer think that the cross-court rally on the ad side of the court, I no longer think that that's an advantage for Djokovic. And that's a key difference. But I think that Novak understands that. And I don't think that Novak tries to win the match by basically looking for that ad court, cross court rally. I don't think that Djokovic places any emphasis on trying to rush Nadal on the forehand side when he plays Nadal on a clay court. So I think Djokovic's tactics are completely different on a clay court. So here's what I think Djokovic tries to do instead. And I've seen Dominic Thiem do this very effectively to Nadal on clay as well. I think that Djokovic instead tries to pin Nadal in his backhand corner. Try to hit heavy to the Nadal backhand, make him hit, high open stance backhands from the corner and go from there trying to open up the court with the forehand. So I think it's the other cross-court rally that Novak Djokovic is looking for. So here's an example of when it works. Djokovic, heavy cross-court to the Nadal backhand. And now Nadal tries to defend down the line here, but it's too weak, it's too short. Djokovic runs around the backhand and this time hits an inside-in forehand for a winner. But of course, tennis is all about attack and counterattack. You can try to have a pattern that, you like all you want, but Nadal will, of course, have a counter, a way to change the pattern. It's very interesting. According to Tennis Abstract, Rafa Nadal hit more backhands down the line in this match against Djokovic than he did forehands down the line. And as I'm watching this match, and when I watch Nadal on clay, at any time, I always notice he loves to hit the backhand down the line, whether he is using it to trade, or sometimes even he'll defend down the line, which is really not what you teach. You defend cross court, lower part of the net, more court to work with, and you attack down the line. That's basic tennis directionals. But watch Nadal on clay. He doesn't defend with his backhand cross court all the time. Many times he'll defend with his backhand down the line because he's trying to change the unfavorable pattern. He knows that he will lose that cross court rally on a clay court. Righty forehand to Nadal's backhand, even as great as Nadal's backhand is, that's not really the rally he wants to play. He'd much rather be on the other side. So he uses a pattern changer, okay? He uses a pattern changing backhand down the line, or a neutralizing defensive backhand down the line. Both does the same thing. He's attempting to take what is a cross-court rally on the deuce side and change it to a cross-court rally on the ad side. Djokovic this time hits a backhand down the line. Again, Nadal in a defensive position, a sliding, running backhand, but he hits it down the line. Plenty of loop on these backhands down the line. That's important, not only because it gives Nadal net clearance and safety, but also because it gives him time to recover to the middle of the court. So Djokovic, here's another perk. Djokovic hits this at shoulder level. He probably would rather hit this at a lower level contact point, and he'd probably get more on it if he hit it at a lower contact point. But here Djokovic goes cross court and hits it with great depth. But still, Nadal gets what he wants here. Nadal gets his forehand, and now he can hit the same shot that we talked about at the beginning. This forehand down the line, which is the biggest weapon on the court. I don't care who he's playing. It's the biggest weapon on the court. And he can win himself. He can give himself a chance at using that weapon with the pattern-changing backhand down the line, like he does here. And he puts it in a perfect spot, and it is a clean winner in a massive, massive point in the match. So again, I think that the way Nadal is able to control his backhand down the line in neutral and defensive positions, it gives him so many opportunities to use his forehand. And by my count, nothing set up the forehand down the line by Nadal in this match more than the backhand down the line. But it's the ability to hit both of those shots with incredible control. At the end of the day, I find that this is why you can see the advantage that Djokovic might have on a fast court when we just talk about directionals and patterns. Those advantages are eliminated on clay, and of course you'll see a much different story head-to-head on clay when Djokovic meets Nadal, as opposed to when Djokovic meets Nadal on hard courts or grass. All right, that just about does it. Without further ado, my conversation about the 2013 French Open semifinal with Steve Flink. We're joined once again by Hall of Fame tennis writer Steve Flink of tennis.com. You know him very well by now. Steve, pleasure to have you back on. It's been a little while.
Thanks, Gill. Looking forward to once again dissecting an important match in tennis history. And as always, I love to chew on these topics with you.
Oh, yeah. So if you like what you hear in this one, Steve and I have done this twice before during this pandemic. We went back and we looked at the 1984 French Open final between Yvonne Lendl and John McEnroe, and we looked at the 2001 U.S. Open quarterfinal between Andre Agassi and Pete Sampras. We continue to go ahead in time this time, and we're looking at what is for sure the best meeting between Novak Djokovic and Rafael Nadal at the French Open. That came in 2013 in the semifinals. Steve, there's no doubt about that. There's been a couple times where these two have met in the French, and it's been highly anticipated, but this one really lived up to the billing.
Absolutely, Gill. They'd started the first time they ever played in this rivalry. They played every year since 2006. Their first meeting was at Roland Garros in 2006, and Rafa won a fairly routine couple of sets, hard-fought sets, 4-4, and then Novak had to retire, some type of an injury, and that's what commenced the rivalry. And they met there again the next couple of years. But everybody knew in those years, Gill, that there was no way Novak was ready to beat him yet in a match of that consequence. And Rafa won those fairly comfortably. But by the time we get to 2013, a lot has changed, and we'd had the pendulum had swung in the rivalry, because at one stage, Rafa had a 16-7 lead, and then Novak cut that to 16-14. By the time we come into this French semi of 13, it's 19-15 in favor of Rafa. It's gotten much tighter. And a lot of people thought coming into the semifinal, even though Novak had lost to Rafa in the finals the year before, when he was going for 4 majors in a row, something he did accomplish in 2015 and 16, but almost got there in 2012. Rafa beat him in a rain-delayed 4-set final. So here we are in 13, and highly anticipated clash in the semis, and Rafa had struggled early in the tournament. So this match really had the look and feel all along of being that it could turn into an epic. And many of us thought that Novak had a pretty good shot at winning that day.
What do you think Djokovic took away from that 2012 final? It was the first time they had met each other in a final at the French Open. And as you said, Djokovic had a fair bit of momentum as the rain started to come down. He was up a break in the 4th set. They had to resume the match on Monday, and from there, it was all Rafa. But what do you think Novak took away from that match?
Well, I think he felt, it's just what you were alluding to. I think he felt very disappointed that if only they could have kept playing the first night, but they were playing through rain. But he was handling at the end of it. He was in a much calmer state and hitting through the court, hitting through the ball beautifully. And Rafa was the one who was agitated. So Rafa, from 2-0 and a breakup in the 3rd, lost 8 straight games, and finally held his serve to make it 2-1 to stay only 1 break down. And that helped coming into the next day. But I think Novak felt like he had all this momentum, and that if the weather had only held and there'd been more light and they could have concluded it on the Sunday, that he might well have come away with a victory, because everything was going his way. And he certainly was doing better in the rainy conditions than Rafa. There's no doubt that he was able to generate more pace and hit more penetrating shots than Rafa was able to do. So I think he felt like, okay, I really had a chance that day. And by 13, it's a different story altogether. Plus, he knew that Rafa, the first couple of rounds in Roland Garros of 13, wasn't very sharp, and he got better as the tournament progressed. But Novak was feeling like, by that stage, he'd had a win over him on clay earlier in the season. So he felt like, okay, I can do this. Best of 5 or not, I can do it. And we should tell everybody, Gill, it was a sunny day, but quite windy throughout the match. They both had to cope with those difficult conditions, and it impaired them both at different times for different reasons, but it made for an even more fascinating encounter.
That's interesting. Yeah, we'll get into that for sure. But first, another thing I think to note is that after that match in 2012, Nadal sustained a rather serious knee injury, and I think that this was a time where people had serious doubts about Nadal's ability to come back strong. He missed 7 months. He missed the U.S. Open. He missed the Australian Open. It was fairly astonishing how well Nadal came back from this injury.
Yeah, you're right. He had gone on to Wimbledon. That's where we first found out. And I think it was the wear and tear of another typically long and debilitating clay court season for Rafa that had ended with a French Open win, which was nice, but it did him in, as you said. And absolutely. So he had to come back early in the 2013 season after missing the Australian, and it took him a while to get his bearings, but he got going, and he was playing some of his best tennis. He played really well through the clay circuit, and not his all-time best year on the clay, but certainly looking sharp and getting some confidence. But still, it had been in the back of his mind. He knew what he'd gone through, Gill, so he still wasn't quite as sure of himself as he was most years heading into Roland Garros.
Right. So Nadal, he did win Barcelona, Madrid, and Rome, but when he had to play Djokovic in Monte Carlo, he dropped that match 6-2. 7-6. All right, so let's
Exactly.
start this.
It was a clear cut 2-6 because the tiebreaker
Yeah.
wasn't even clear. So no doubt that they both were aware of that too. Now Rafa liked the fact that this was now going to be best of 5, but there were just so many reasons to look forward to this match.
So let's get into it, shall we? Let's start. The match
Sure.
begins. Immediately, what I'm most impressed by, and it'll give us a chance to talk about a major theme with Nadal, I'm immediately impressed by Nadal's serve. Now, Djokovic was uncharacteristic on the return, really not hitting the neutralizing returns that we're used to seeing, but it was a very dominant serving start and a really nice service rhythm at the beginning in the first set by Nadal, and that's what stuck out to me in the early going.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, he didn't lose his serve in that first set. It just came down to one break, and he did a nice job of backing his serve up. He served nicely into the body. He mixed it up well. Novak definitely didn't find his range on the returns yet in that set, no doubt about it. And then there was a carryover, Gill, because Rafa was able to get up that break in the second. He was up a break at 3-2. So you really felt, and I felt sitting there watching it live, oh boy, Rafa, if he cements this and goes up 2 sets, forget it. I mean, you're not going to beat him from 2 sets to love. And Novak was well aware of that. And I thought it was a remarkable surge from Djokovic from 3-2 down in the second, down a break to break 2 times running, win 4 games in a row, and run out the set. He really lifted his game during that stretch. And as you said, Rafa up until then, he was unbreakable. But now Novak got him 2 times running to make it 1 set all rather than finding himself in a 2-set deficit.
Djokovic keyed in on the return at 3-4. It flipped, and that's kind of the game you're alluding to where Djokovic surges, gets the break back. He made some really great aggressive returns. As for Nadal's serve, which
that, of course, we should say, Gil, that was actually, by then it was the second break because he'd come from 3-2 down already to break back, right. And that actually put him the break up. So that was remarkable that given what you just said about Rafa serving up until that stage, Rafa had felt in a comfort zone on his serve. And now here he is getting broken 2 times running to lose the set, which I think was kind of jarring. But then we had a really bizarre third set because Rafa started with a deuce game on his serve, but the next thing you know, he's up 5-love, and he's got 15-40 on Novak's serve, and Novak was lucky to win the 1 game. And Novak definitely looked physically a bit flummoxed. Something was not right with him physically or mentally in that set, and he pretty much conceded it by the time he got down 2 breaks. And he knew he was lucky to win the 1 game that he got. And I remember thinking at the time, Gill, sitting there in the press section, is he going to be able to physically stay with him in the 4th? How is he going to do this? I mean, maybe it was wise to lose the set quickly and not waste too much energy, but you just wondered, could he summon some inner strength there to come back and be physically strong enough to compete favorably in the 4th?
Well, Djokovic's first serve completely escaped him. He hit it at 32% in this third set. And I also found that he was thrown off balance a lot with and I think the wind played a factor, and Nadal's heavy topspin also played a factor. It was also a hot day, so the court dried up. The ball was bouncing high. It was, I would think it's kind of nightmarish conditions to play Nadal. Would you say that? I mean, I consider Nadal to be a tremendous wind player.
I agree with that, but we saw it work in both players' favor at different times. I thought it might be an advantage. I also think there were times earlier on, though, Gill, before Rafa started striking some of those spectacular inside-out forehand winners, where he was a little bit inhibited off this forehand side early on, and that I felt was where the wind maybe got in his way a bit. It worked both ways and fluctuated throughout the match, but to me, those 4th and 5th sets, Gill, as is so often the case in classic 5-set matches, were by far, far and away the best tennis of the match in the 4th and 5th.
It seems to me that an overwhelming majority of classic best-of-5 tennis matches feature a 4th set tiebreak. I mean, it seems like a really common theme.
Yeah, absolutely. And you saw it in the. It happens so many times, and it especially tough for the player who's trying to come from behind, the way that we saw with Rafa in the 12 Australian, where he nearly beat Novak in the epic 5-hour 53-minute match, is that he he was fighting to stay alive in the fourth and managed to do it. And here it's Novak. But here's what struck me about this fourth set, Gill. Rafa goes up the break. He's got 4-3. You're thinking, okay, 2 more holds, and he's got himself a well-deserved, fairly clear-cut 4-set win. And I remember thinking at the time when he got the first break that that's exactly what was going to happen. It's a great front runner, as we all know, and all of the great players kind of share that trait. And Novak played such a great game there to break back, where he hit it was like almost, there weren't 4-out winners. There were 2 winners. One was an incredible angle backhand return, and then another great. He ended up hitting another approach on the baseline, another winner that he almost invented, backhand angle winner off a shot that Nadal hit down the middle. And finally, he hits an angle forehand return that Nadal can't handle on the backhand down the line. Just a great game to break back. But Rafa, unruffled, as I'm sure you noticed too, breaks again to now serve for the match. And that to me was incredibly gutsy game from Djokovic, because Rafa hits 2 inside-out forehand winners in a row to go 30-15. He's 2 points away from winning 7-5 in the fourth. Then he pressed a little bit, going for another forehand winner from a very deep position and trying to go inside in, and he missed it, fair enough. But then Djokovic plays a great backhand return virtually on the baseline that forced Rafa into a miss-hit forehand, and then he takes control of the next rally and hits a forehand winner off a looping backhand from Nadal. So again, I don't think Rafa did much poorly in either. You could fault him for maybe the 30-15 era serving for the match, but he just made 2 winners. He went for a third in a row and he couldn't pull it off. I think this was more about Djokovic playing 2 great return games to keep himself in that match. Don't you agree?
I do agree. And especially the returns. I think it all started with the returns.
Oh, absolutely.
All 3 of them were perfect. All 3 of them were within 2 feet of the baseline. And that's just a common theme throughout Djokovic's career, that, not every return is going to be perfect, but in the biggest points of the match, if he keeps a racket on it, it's generally a great return.
Yeah, absolutely. But in turn, he took control of those points when Rafa tried to fend him off. And I thought that was remarkable. So it was understandable to me, Gill, that Rafa didn't play a very inspired tiebreaker. Novak didn't lose any points on his serve. He got the mini break early, went right up 2-love early, and he really never looked like losing that tie. But understandable, because here's Rafa by the middle, I'm sure from the start of that tie break, sort of wondering why he's still on the court. A little bit shocked that he hadn't been able to close him out, knowing that it wasn't his fault, but thinking that the match could have been over. And Novak really soaring with confidence at this stage. So here it is, an easy tiebreak win for Novak takes us into that 5th set. And then, of course, it carries over because he gets the break right away at the start of the 5th.
Yeah, I was surprised at how scratchy that first game of the 5th set was. Uncharacteristic by Nadal, a double fault in an error to start. Going back to the tiebreak.
Sorry to interrupt. And then he gets himself down love 40, and he just couldn't recover. It got to 30-40, and it was too much. Right. You're right. It was scratchy. And again, I think he was a little disconcerted about not knowing that he twice had the break in the fourth, and late in the fourth, one at 4-3, and then serving for the match at 6-5. Those are situations where he likes his chances. So I think it was playing on Rafa's mind. We know how mentally tough he is. He might be the toughest player mentally we've ever seen in the men's game, but even he is human. And I think that he was very unhappy not to have closed him in 4.
Let's take a second to talk about the crowd here. The match started and it was lunchtime in Paris because Tsonga was in the semifinal. So this match was slated first up. It was Tsonga Ferrer, the second matchup. But by this point in the 4th set, there was not a single empty seat, and there was constantly these dueling Nole and Rafa chants. And I'm just wondering how you assessed the crowd, and in general, when these 2 met at the French Open, how you assessed the crowd support.
The crowd, Rafa almost always had with rare exceptions. One of the exceptions would be when he lost to Soderling in 2009, and he'd won 4 in a row at that stage. And he was actually quite upset that year that when he lost to Soderling, that the crowd really got behind the underdog and they were kind of rude to him. Otherwise, I think these crowds are largely on his side. They were very appreciative of Djokovic's most inspired tennis. They weren't coming down hard on Novak by any means, but Rafa was a fixture at Roland Garros, as we've seen then and as we've since seen. They really appreciated his spunk and his professionalism and his clay court expertise. So I think that crowd was largely on his side, but not to the point of. It wasn't like a crowd that Novak experiences, say, when he plays Roger. There still was some appreciation for him, and they certainly were not applauding his mistakes. And when he would go into a great spell, like he did at the end of the second set with the 4-game run, or when he pulled out the fourth, they definitely showed their appreciation in a pretty effusive way. So I think they were actually pretty fair, but Rafa really had enduring support at Roland Garros. Always has.
I agree. So we go to a fifth set. It's the first 5-set match that Nadal has played at the French, other than the 2011. Was that a first-round match against John Isner?
Yes. Yeah, it was.
So
that was a very awkward match. The Isner match was it was such an atypical clay court match, with Isner basically playing his same brand of tennis, the big serving and explosive power, especially off his forehand side, and giving Rafa no rhythm. And that was a very arduous match. You're right. But yeah, absolutely. So here we are. But this is more conventional. This is too great, because by now Djokovic really has established himself as a great clay courter in his own right. So this is more. And the other thing, Gill, was it wasn't nearly as long as the 5-hour, 53-hour contest in Australia the previous year. This one, especially because we had the quick third set, this was moving along at a faster clip. So, but still, it's still 5, and it's still demanding clay court points.
We mentioned that Djokovic goes up the early break in the 5th set, and my underrated game of the match is at 1-3.
Gill, and let me just say something right here and right now. And I don't want the viewers to take this the wrong way, but I'm tempted to say that great minds think alike, because that game, I couldn't agree with you more. That game was critical, because if Djokovic goes up 2 breaks 4-1 in the 5th, it's going to be almost impossible, even for someone as indefatigable as Rafa Nadal, to stop him. And the tennis that Nadal played to pull out that game, the shot that I remember the most was at 30-all.
Yes.
And Novak had pulled Rafa off the court with a cross-court forehand. He thought he had the point 1. Rafa on the run on the full stretch hits a backhand cross-court winner on the sideline, and had Novak kind of grinning. Novak would always acknowledge some of those shots. He knew it wasn't lucky, but he also knew it was improbable, and that could have given him a break point. And that game goes to a couple of deuces, and Novak was pushing hard to get this insurance break, and Rafa just would not let him have it. And Rafa won that game, held on with another magnificent cross-court backhand winner. So that was a really critical game, pivotal game, and one where Nadal displayed a lot of guts.
Yeah, and a backhand down the line at deuce to set up the game point that Nadal ultimately secured. So the backhand is the hero here. I mean, Nadal's backhand was sensational in this game at 1-3, and this isn't the game that's most remembered in this match. That would go to the 3-4 game that we'll get to in a moment. But I'm glad we both agree that this is a game where Djokovic played well enough to really put this match away, and Nadal didn't let him.
No, exactly. Nadal didn't let him, because Novak, by no means did he throw it away, and he really threw a lot of artillery at Rafa. He really wanted that game badly, because he knew what it would mean to go 2 breaks up, and everything was going in his favor from the time that Rafa had served from the match, and Novak breaks, and Novak sweeps the tiebreak easily. He's got the early break in the 5th. If he goes 2 breaks up, he knew he would be virtually unstoppable. And Rafa knew it too, which is why it was so commendable to see him dig in so deep in that game and keep himself. And that's one of the things that's always impressed me about him. I remember he was in a similar situation later in the year at the 2013 U.S. Open final, when Novak was threatening to go up 2 breaks and perhaps pull away in the 3rd set, and then it was a set all at that stage, and Rafa managed to fend him off, and you saw him look up at his corner when he held to keep himself, from going down a couple of breaks. and he looked up at his entourage, and you could tell he was saying to them, "Hey, I needed that, and I needed it badly, and I'm going to be okay now." And he's very expressive that way. You know, he doesn't hide that. I mean, it's not showing to the whole stadium, but if you're paying close attention, you see it written all over him with his expressions.
Yeah, and incredibly brave shot selection under pressure, and that is kind of a theme in the fifth set, is that he's really willing to take risks. And he starts to feel it. He holds the next game with 3 forehand winners. It's a relatively easy hold, and that sets up this game at 4-3, which is a game that everyone remembers, but I don't know if, not to discount its importance, but everyone remembers this point at deuce where Djokovic has an easy put away semi overhead that should have been kind of a dink over the net, and Djokovic touches the net. But there were a lot of other moments in this game that
yes, but let's talk. But before we get to the other moments, let's not bypass that. First of all, you said something that is very important. The score was deuce. In many people's minds, when it was written about and analyzed later, you would have thought it was a game point, and that therefore he blew the chance to have a 5-3 lead, that he'd have that locked. No, deuce is not safe against Rafa Nadal, obviously. But what was a killer for Novak on that point was he hit a perfect approach into the corner off his forehand from the ball that had been hit down the middle. Couldn't have executed it better. Rafa put up, you said it was like a semi-overhead. It was almost like a semi-lob from Rafa. He was trying to loft it up there. He really didn't get much height on it. And I think Novak would have been much better off to have just closed and hit a little angled drop volley. It would have been high enough. It would have been almost impossible to miss it if he got it. And he was pretty tight on the net. Instead, he chose to hit that, what amounted to an overhead, but, you know, was more of a tap. And you could almost call it a high forehand volley. And yes, he touched the net. It was a shame for him, because I honestly think that Djokovic of 2015 or 16 and beyond would not have made what was kind of a mental error. You got to be much more aware of how close your body is to the net. And they all know you can't do that. You have to avoid that. And it was a point, there's no way he should have lost it. Rafa, as you probably noticed, immediately started motioning with his head. He knew. He's pointing and saying, hey, he knew. And Novak knew it too, even though he discussed it with the umpire. He knew that it was a terrible error in judgment, because there's no way should he lose that point. But what we have to say is, what does he do on the next point? He comes right back now down the ad and hits a beautiful swing volley on his forehand to force an error from Rafa. He's back to deuce again. So he really didn't fold after that error and collapse by any means. He made Rafa earn that break back. But there's no doubt that point, it's one we all it's irrevocably lodged in our minds, because it was just such a dramatic moment, and you don't expect to see a player of Djokovic's stature make that kind of an error, and allow himself to lose a point that he had no business losing.
Right. It was shocking. Another note is that Nadal had a break point on the point prior and makes one of the more shocking forehand errors of the match, and Nadal couldn't believe it. He put his hands up to his head because it really wasn't, he was set up for the forehand. He had it lined up, and he missed it quite badly.
I don't think he would have hit a winner, Gill, on that. He was set up to hit an aggressive shot that might have, where he would have put himself in a commanding position to win the point, but he totally mishit it. He just totally mishit it. And the look on Djokovic did sort of a semi fist pump after that. And because I think it was an error he did not expect. So that's why he was so beautifully set up on the deuce point before he touched the net with his body like that. That, I think he just gotten a reprieve, and he wanted to take advantage of it.
But Nadal ultimately earns himself a break point with one of the best cross-court neutralizing backhands from a defensive position of the match. A really well-earned point there, and Djokovic faltered on break point with the forehand unforced error. Yeah,
that was a little surprising. The forehand, I think he was a little tight on that. He hit it in the net. It's not the kind of error you would have expected, but on the other hand, that would have been an emotional game. And I'm sure the incident at the net, and touching the net was still weighing on his mind. And so suddenly, instead of 5-3 for Novak, who never even did get to game point, he fended off the break points, but he suddenly found himself 4-all, and that was obviously a very, jarring development for Djokovic, and a great moment of inspired sense of renewal for Nadal.
Djokovic, I thought, had a really good hold at 4-5. It was 30 all. Things got tense. He was 30 love up, but strong serve, good forehands, forces an error. And then another point where Djokovic hits a lot of dictating forehand. So I think a really strong hold at 4-5, despite people remembering this match, not remembering this match for Djokovic's clutchness. I thought this was a point late in the fifth set where he easily could have been broken once again, and played some really good aggressive tennis in that 4-5 game.
Listen, I totally agree. He held his nerve beautifully there and played those points from 30 all beautifully and kept himself in the match. What was tough, Gill, was from the time that Rafa was back to 4 all on serve, having gotten that critical break back, he was losing a point a game on his serve. His service games were moving by swiftly. Novak was getting no opening. So then each time he would change ends and know he was serving to stay in the match, it was tough mentally. It's not as if he was creating any more opportunities to break. Rafa played with a lot of discipline through that stretch. And then finally, of course, and Novak followed with a couple of really good games, I thought, at 5-6 and 6-7 as well. But finally at 7-8, after Rafa's had another easy hold, Rafa played a great, hit a cross-court backhand winner. He got himself to love 30, and then Novak on the last 2 points, those were just solid down the middle looping returns from Rafa that Novak overhit off the forehand. I think finally it got to him a bit. It was understandable because it's the 4th time you're serving to stay in the match. You knew that you were up the break. You knew everything was sort of heading in your direction from late in the 4th into the middle of the 5th, and he couldn't quite close them out. And the other thing to mention is they knew, before they even walked on the court, when you're talking about either Ferrer or Tsonga in the final, the feeling was from either one of them, they weren't going to lose that final. I think they both were very confident that, and Rafa, he did go out of his way to defend David Ferrer in his press conference the next day and say, people that talk that way about David Ferrer, they just don't know tennis. He's a tough man to beat. And he means that, but on the other hand, he's confident against him. And Djokovic would have been confident too, that over the best of 5, as tough as Ferrer is as a fighter, that he so in a sense, what I'm saying is these two guys, I think, were looking at their semifinal, had a definite feel of a final. The prevailing view was that whoever won this match was almost surely going to win the tournament. Rafa definitely, and Novak very likely.
Steve, I feel like the high volley putaways, I think they crushed Djokovic's spirit a bit. At 7 all, 40-15, Djokovic had a game point, and Nadal hits a tweener lob, but it's not a particularly deep lob, and Djokovic misses another easy putaway at the net. And then the 7-8 game when Novak ultimately gets broken for the match on the first point, Djokovic gets an overhead, and it's another ugly miss.
Bad miss. That put him in real trouble. You're absolutely right. That was a awful way to start that game. No, listen, during this hiatus, during this period when we haven't had any official tournaments being played, and he's done some things that have been on the internet, some Zoom type things, different people, he did one with Stan Wawrinka where they talked about some of their matches, and in one of those sessions, he was very open about sort of his vulnerabilities, and he joked about his overhead. And almost saying, in essence, I hope maybe there's somebody out there that can teach me and I did an overhead. It has been an issue his whole career. Having said that, I've seen him make some very difficult overheads at certain times in certain matches. It comes and goes, but if he's tight, he had one on match point against Nadal way back when in the Olympics. And in 2008, where he missed an easy overhead that cost him the match and off a pretty short lob. So no doubt that's been an Achilles heel, but it's pretty hard to exploit it. And how many overheads is he going to hit in a match? And in fairness to him, when he's relaxed and he's not thinking too much about the score, I've seen him make some against Federer that have been spectacular, that were actually not easy overheads, but he's made them look easy. So it's in his head. I really believe it's in his head. It's not his technique. You suddenly see him slow down the speed of the racket. And you see him rather than just swing freely, you can feel him tightening up. And you're right. That's exactly what happened at the end of the match against Rafa. Heartbreaking loss for Djokovic and one of the most exhilarating wins, I think, for Nadal. And what he said afterwards, Gill, was fascinating. You and I have talked many times about the 2012 Australian final, the 5-hour 53 epic, in that Nadal came so close to winning after leading 4-2, 30-15 in the final set. And he had a passing shot that with an open court, Djokovic stranded, and Rafa steered a backhand pass wide down the line, could have given him 40-15, and he probably would have won that match. But my point is, he said after Roland Garros, Novak probably should have won this today, and I should have won in Australia, which was a very nice way to look at it. He's a very fair-minded guy, and he knew, all things being equal, he probably should have closed out Novak in Australia, and Novak probably should have closed him out on this particular afternoon. But he was kind of looking at it philosophically, like that's how tennis works, and things might even out at times. And you're going to win some matches that you should lose, and vice versa. And I thought that was a very interesting way for him to look at it, and very accurate.
I agree. I mean, the parallels between these two matches are rather uncanny. You have the 6-1 set. You have a tremendous fourth set escape to force a fifth. You have the winner of the fourth set taking a lead in the fifth set. Then you have a highly memorable blunder. Then you have overtime fifth set tennis. And ultimately, Nadal wins on his, home major, so to speak, the French, and Djokovic takes it in Australia.
Yeah. Now, of course, if Novak had not gone on in 2016 to finally finish off his career Grand Slam, but become the first to win 4 majors in a row since Laver won the actual Grand Slam in '69, I think this match with Rafa in 13 would be more haunting. The fact that he was able to come back and finally win a French, and he put that on his resume, I think probably helped him to forget this. But this at the time had to, and I think frankly it had lasting implications. I think it's one of the reasons why over that summer, he was still feeling it a bit, and he'd lost the Wimbledon final to Andy Murray, and he comes to the Open final and loses to Rafa in a very hard fought 4-set match where they split the first 2, and finally, Novak had that chance to go up the 2 breaks in the third that I mentioned earlier, and then at 4-all in the third, Rafa, comes back from love 40 to hold his serve. And then he breaks Novak in the next game and romps in the fourth. But I had a feeling there was sort of a lingering. His confidence was wounded. His psyche was wounded by that loss to Rafa in Paris, which was a heartbreaker for him, and that it definitely gave Nadal a boost as well. No doubt about it.
And in the next year, they kind of complete their trilogy. This time, once again, meeting in the final. And it's another 4-set victory by Nadal after dropping that first set. Would you say that Novak didn't find as high a level in this 2014 match as he did in 2013?
Definitely not. Yeah, definitely not. I think he was Rafa didn't play Rafa was quite nervous in 14. I think he felt a lot of pressure, thought it was a match he should win. And Novak was not terribly sharp, and Rafa's having to fight, finally pulls out a tough, long second set, and it turned the match his way. But no, Novak's form was really very in and out in the 14 match. I think he played better in 2012 in the final once he came from that deep deficit, 2 sets down. The tennis he played, especially to pull out the third and go up in the fourth, was better than anything we saw from him in 14. No, Rafa was just a better player. But funny thing is, they both were vulnerable. Rafa had the problem at the start of 2014, losing to Stan Wawrinka for the first time ever. He'd never lost a set to Stan Wawrinka, and he hurt his back in the warm-up. And Stan played a great match and beat Rafa in the finals of the Australian. And Rafa had some lingering problems with his back into that spring. And I think he was still a little bit uneasy coming into the French, and not feeling at the top of his game confidence-wise. But in turn, Novak, I just think physically, things were a little off. I'm not sure exactly what it was, but physically he wasn't quite right. And so it had a similarity in a sense that he gets a set and makes the fourth competitive. It had some parallels to the 2012 final in that sense. But you didn't feel like Novak, even though he fought hard in the fourth, you didn't think he was going to be able to win it. And so, but I would say it was not that standard was nowhere near what we saw in 13 from either of them.
Djokovic did say he wasn't feeling well, wanted to make sure not to be using that as an excuse, but that could have been a reason why.
But I think Rafa, in fairness, Gill, I don't think Rafa was feeling that great in 14 either. So I don't think either one of them, I don't think either player was able to do themselves full justice. So to me, of the really interesting matches they played against each other, you know, whether it was the 12 final, the 13 semi, the 14 final, that one I put down at the bottom. I just think they did the best they could under trying circumstances when neither one was really prepared to play their best tennis. They just were trying to get through it.
And then Djokovic finally gets the better of Nadal in 2015. How would you compare the two, I would say, 4-part series that occurred early on in the 2000s, from 2005 to 2008? It was these meetings between Nadal and Federer. And then this was kind of the next era from 2012 to 2015, these series of matches at Roland Garros, Nadal against Djokovic. How would you compare those two?
Comparing the Nadal, I'm not sure what you're asking.
Well, I'm always interested in the fact that I don't think that the Federer meetings really lived up to what they should have been for some reason. I think that Federer was a little bit intimidated early on by Nadal.
Yeah, right. Okay, I get you now. Yeah, I listen, I think I take it a step further. I was thinking about it as I was thinking about doing this segment with you today. I honestly believe that as riveting, as stylistic the matchup is with Federer and Nadal, and there's more of a contrast, obviously, because of the way Roger plays. Just, you know, whether Roger plays Novak or Rafa, you get the contrast. And he's a classic player. He's got the classic strokes, and he can attack, he can defend, he's got touch, he's got power. You know, he's going to bring out a contrast. But I believe that there have been more high quality matches played between Djokovic and Nadal. That, yes, there's no doubt in the early stages, Roger, and funny enough, it's a couple of things, and that's the exception of the 2008 Wimbledon final, which I think is still the greatest match I've ever seen with Rafa and Roger. But there have been many other times when in the early stages that you mentioned, Rafa was in Roger's head, and Roger could not figure Rafa out, and you sense the kind of this sort of confusion in Federer's mind about how to go about beating him. He didn't know quite what to do. Then suddenly after 15, you know, and especially starting in 17, when Rafa lost to Roger after leading 3-1 in the 5th set of the Australian final, suddenly Roger began to get into Rafa's head. And I don't mean by any gamesmanship from either one of them in either case, by the way, just the circumstances of Roger improving his backhand and taking it earlier and finding a new methodology to combat Rafa, and Rafa not quite as sure of himself playing Roger. And suddenly, so you see, we've seen matches, for instance, you were going to 05-08, but I thought one of the most disappointing quality matches from Nadal against Federer was the one last year in the semis of Wimbledon. I don't think he played well at all. I think it was a brilliant performance from Federer, but disappointing from Nadal. While these two guys, look at what Djokovic and Nadal have done in the period that you're describing. We had that incredible Australian 5-hour, 53-minute masterpiece won by Djokovic, 7-5 in the 5th. We have this one, which goes to 9-7 in the 5th, and Rafa pulls it out. And then we have that Wimbledon semi in 18. Granted, some distance between, but it's a third major, a third 5-setter, right down to the wire, 10-8 in the 5th. Djokovic pulls it out and goes on to win the tournament. I mean, pretty astounding. I mean, we don't have an epic like that from them at the U.S. Open. We have some very good ones. But in 3 of the 4 majors, they've produced epics against each other. Not to mention there's been a number of other matches, too, that have been pretty riveting between the two. So maybe it's not as great a stylistic matchup, but I believe they played more high-quality contests against each other than Rafa and Roger have.
I agree. That's a great point. And I think the astonishing thing about the big three is that you can make an argument for any of the matchups that they are the most entertaining. And it's just a matter of taste. because, you know, you have things to lean on for, again, each matchup. Let's end it on this, though, talking about
just a quick
Sure.
thing, sorry, before we get off this. Then,
Sure.
of course, we throw another into the mix that
Murray.
might require a whole separate discussion. That would be the Djokovic-Federer rivalry, which has also been a beauty.
Yeah.
And also
Most
given us some,
unpredictable, maybe.
yeah, most unpredictable, and in some ways the most fun to watch for me. Of the three matchups, Nadal-Federer, Djokovic-Federer, and Nadal-Djokovic, I think that Djokovic-Federer might be the most fun to watch. But I think the most high-quality skirmishes I've seen have been Nadal versus Djokovic.
Yeah, I think that's a good assessment. And I agree with you. I think I'm with you on that. Let's end on the Djokovic-Nadal matchup. Djokovic had famously won 7 straight against Nadal in 2011 and 2012. But after this match, after the 2013 US Open final, Nadal had won 6 of the last 7. Since then, Djokovic has won 14 of the last 18. So a bit of a pendulum tendency that we've seen in this rivalry. So I'm curious, what do you think are the main ingredients when it comes to who's getting the best of this matchup?
I think that Nadal, as early by 2011, I think we're going to hear it from him someday when his career is over and he can speak openly and not worry anymore about rivalries that are still in progress. But I think he will say that to him, even despite the fact that Roger had this great resurgence against him in the recent years, that Djokovic was always the biggest nightmare for him to play. Because unless Novak's forehand is off, look at the patterns. Novak goes cross-court into Rafa's weaker wing, and that favors him. Rafa tries to use that cross-court forehand of his, which is the trademark shot that destroys everybody else. And Novak has that incredible two-hander to combat that. Mm-hmm. And I just think he has that ability to hit Rafa off the court, to out-defend him, and he's a better server. I think Rafa really believes that he needs Novak to be a little off in some way, whether it's mentally or whether his forehand is just not quite as sharp as usual, and he can try to exploit that, but that he feels like he doesn't have anywhere to go. That's how I look at it. And I think he knew that as early as 11. Now, Novak went through some emotional instability or difficulty, you might say, in after 11. There were periods in 12 and 13 where he's more vulnerable mentally. And you saw it, for instance, in the 4th set of that 2013 US Open final, where he should have still been more competitive than he was. He'd lost a tough 3rd set after being up the early break, and after Rafa held from 4-all, love 40, end of the set. But Novak, he didn't compete particularly well in the 4th, and he lost at 6-1. And I just think that there were periods in those years where he kind of maybe gave in a little emotionally. Wasn't as tough as we know he can be. But I think Rafa feels like that's what he had. He needs something like that. And Rafa will pounce when he sees any vulnerability. It's technical or mental. He will exploit it. But I think that if all things being equal, if no form that he was, for instance, in the last year's, not this year's, the 2019 Australian final when he destroyed Rafa in straight sets, Rafa believes that there's not much he can do to deal him. There's not much he can do to stop him. I think he believes, I'm surprised I can say this, but he believes in his gut that all things being equal, Novak at his best is just a better player than he is.
Well, the cross courts are certainly a nightmare. And you mentioned that. I think on clay, it's a little bit better because on clay, I favor Nadal on the ad side cross court. So for Nadal's forehand to Djokovic's backhand. But on a faster surface, I think it tilts to Djokovic.
Oh, yeah, no doubt. No doubt. Listen, clay just overall makes it tilt to Rafa. So you're right. And that pattern is not as much of a nightmare. But you still see it. You saw it in large stretches of this beautiful match in 2013 of what Djokovic can do to neutralize that Nadal forehand. And I think the beauty of what Nadal did that day that we didn't talk about was he hit some crucial forehand down the line winners. And it was the forehand down the line that got him the break in the 1st set, a couple of really good ones that got him that first break that put him up a set, and then some beauties later on in the 5th set too, where you couldn't believe from the position he was in behind the baseline off a pretty good cross-court backhand from Novak, that Rafa could snap that forehand down the line, inches inside the sideline, or sometimes right on the line for outright winners that were not lucky. They were just brilliantly executed.
Oh, the winners coming off of Nadal's racket were incredible in the fifth set and plentiful. One last point from me is I think that there have been times in the rivalry where Nadal's serve really hasn't given him a chance because they can be so equal at the baseline. Sometimes Djokovic has the upper hand from the baseline. But in 2011 and 2012, I thought Nadal's serve really took a step back. And I think the same for that 2018 Wimbledon semifinal. Nadal's serve wasn't helping him at all. So even if he played brilliantly from the baseline, I thought Djokovic still had the edge. In 2013, coming back from the knee injury, his serve was a little better. You can say the same thing about 2010. And what I find very interesting is you can say the same thing about where Nadal's serving is at right now.
Well, here's the thing, Gill. I used to feel like, I think that's good analysis, very sound analysis. I just used to feel that, for instance, watching the 2010 US Open final, I was watching with one of the French riders, and I kept saying to him, he's got to go short and wide in that ad court. Don't go to the corner. Novak will destroy that return. You've got to pull him short and wide. And sure enough, that was his most effective serve. But that worked in the early years. I just think in the end, the question is, could Nadal ever be a good enough server, at his best even, to thwart that Djokovic return? Federer runs into the same problem. There's certain matches, long stretches at Wimbledon last year, where obviously up until the end of the fourth, Novak, he won the first and third in tie breaks, but didn't break them those first three sets. It wasn't until deep into the fourth that he did. So there are certain days, but I don't think he was having a good day on the return there. My point is, I think if Novak is right on his returns, he can really make Rafa have to think too much about where he's going to locate that serve. And it puts tremendous pressure on Rafa. Look at 2019 coming into the final. He had a good draw to be sure, but nobody was breaking him. He was looking great on his serve. And there was all this talk about technical differences, what Moy had done. They were doing things with the toss. It's going to come over with more speed. It's going to get to the returner more quickly. But then as soon as he got out there against Djokovic, he didn't look like the same guy. But I guess I'm giving more of the credit to Djokovic because I think it takes a server of Roger's caliber. Yeah. And he will struggle himself. But you have to have a great serve like Roger to have a chance to really exploit Novak. And Rafa will never have a great serve. He has, at his best, his serve is very good.
Agreed. Okay, before we go, what's the jacket?
Oh, okay. Well, this jacket is, I'll try to hold it up a little bit. Yeah. But this is from the 1990 Roland Garros. And I've had it for 30 years. And I use it all the time, especially in the summer. It's perfect when you don't want to put a sweater on. Have a shirt like you're wearing, for instance. I have a workout shirt on now, but you might have a shirt just a little come in from the heat and your air conditioning. You want something just a little bit more. I can't believe that 30 years later, it's still in impeccable condition. So I'm proud that I still have it, and I hope I can make it last a lot longer. It's
a gem, Steve. The colors, the throwback logo, that one's a keeper, no doubt.
Yeah. Well, you have the mugs and I have the jacket, so we have it all covered.
All right, Steve. Thanks so much. We'll do it again soon.
Gill,
a blast as always.
Thanks for having me on. As always, I enjoyed sharing those insights and replaying those matches and not knowing how you're going to feel about it. That the fun of this for us, I think, is that we don't know. We don't rehearse this. We just get on here and talk. And you've watched the match separately, and I have. And the most fun for me, I have to say, is having seen it live as I did that day, and then go back to it again, look at it again, closer to the time we're going to do our talks. And it brings back the memories of the matches, and it just allows me to delve into it even a little deeper than I did at the time.
Absolutely. Tons of fun. Steve, be safe, be well.
Thanks, Gill. Thanks a lot.